it's important to celebrate things in life. We've talked before about the kind of people at Wizard Academy and the people who launch out and do things and accomplish things. And I talked at one point at the end of that video, which was the 4 kinds of people that you meet, about the importance of celebrating when you've actually achieved something. And that's something that people who are good at setting goals and achieving them are often very bad at celebrating them. And there's a reason for that, but I think it's important that we talk about the need to celebrate, right? Now, first, fuzzy goals are the worst, right? So saying something like, hey, when I grow up, I want to be successful, or I want to be rich, or I want to work in the movie industry, or I want to be a musician. Those are fine, right? But those are not actual, clear, clarified plans or even bona fide, right? Somebody who picks up an instrument and can play 3 chords, in my opinion, is a musician. Because you can pick up and play 3 chords on a guitar and strum them in order. That's musician. Yeah? Are you a good one? Maybe not. Are you an accomplished one? No. Can you play anything outside the 3 chords? No. Are you a musician? Yeah, absolutely you are. Yeah? Now, that's probably not what you were thinking when you said, when I grow up, I want to be a musician. I'm assuming, right? And this is why it's important when you set your goals to set something that is very specific and very clear. Also, and it may be a whole other video, but it needs to be something only you can control. And I'm going to say this sentence here, and then we're going to move on. A goal that depends on someone else doing something is not a goal, it's a hope. Full stop. Right? So, if your goal depends on someone else doing something, that's not a goal, that's a hope. Okay, goals need to be 100% of whether or not it gets accomplished in your control. So, I want to get married, actually not a goal, just a hope. Right? I want to start a business. Hey, that's a goal, because you can do that. Whether it's successful or not, whole other conversation. Okay, so mushy goals, they're the worst. Say, and there's 2 reasons why. One, because you never know if you achieve them, and it's just full of unspoken expectations. And I am a firm believer that unspoken expectations are the source of the vast majority of conflict in our lives. You had an expectation of something, you never verbalized it, it didn't happen, you're mad about it. You're hurt by it. You're like so much of what goes wrong in relationship is because someone had an expectation they either didn't know they had, or they had one, they didn't say it. Anyway, that's, again, a whole other thing. But a goal needs to be clarified, because you can say, hey, I want to be successful, but no one knows what that means. Honestly, maybe even you don't know what that means. So you need to have very specific goals. Saying I want to be in the whiskey industry, not a goal. That's not specific enough. That's like, hey, yeah. Now, I don't know if you know this, but once you get into the whiskey industry, did you realize that there are people who take boxes of whiskey and put them in a van and drive them to specs and deliver them? That's the whiskey industry. That is a very important part of the whiskey industry. As a matter of fact, the bottles of whiskey we make won't get to the retailer and the end consumer in specs unless someone picks up a box, puts it in a van, and carries it to specs. Technically, that's part of the whiskey industry. Is that what you were picturing when you said, I want to work in the whiskey industry? Probably not. Is it part of the whiskey industry? Hell yeah, it is. So that's not clear enough. You could work for a graphic design firm who's designing labels for a whiskey distillery. That makes you in the whiskey industry, my friend. Do you feel like that's the whiskey industry? Maybe not, but you can legitimately tell your friends you work in the whiskey industry. Mike is shooting videos right here behind the camera. He could tell all of his friends he works in the whiskey industry. Is this what they picture when he says that sentence? Probably not. So you need to get more specific. The first one is so that you can know whether or not you've achieved something. But the other one is you can't celebrate something that you haven't defined as an achievable thing in a moment when there's a before and after. It wasn't, now it is. You can't celebrate something that doesn't have a now, before it wasn't, and now it is. You just can't. And celebration is very important. But let's talk about Glendronach. I realized there's a bunch of like really core to me whiskeys that I love and that are like sort of, I just think, fundamental bedrock whiskeys that we either never reviewed on the channel or we reviewed them like 6 years ago, and I would like to do it again. And that's why we're doing Glendronach 12. To me, when people say, what is a quintessential sherry cask scotch? 2 whiskeys pop into my head, Aberlour and Glendronach. Those 2, always. Are there others? Hell yeah. I mean, I think you could argue Macallan. I think you could argue Benriach. I think you could argue Tamdhu. I think you could argue, there's so many. There's so many that are just like, yeah, that's the quintessential in flavor what a sherried scotch should taste like. But for me, oh man, I'm trying to remember when I fell in love with Glendronach, and I was trying to remember when I was doing research for this video, and I just realized I do know the moment I fell in love with Glendronach. I went to a tasting and specs, and a brand rep for the brand that currently owns Glendronach, which is, by the way, who's the company that now owns them? I can't remember who it is. Brown-Forman took over in 2016, and I guess that's still them. But there's a portfolio window, and that is Glenglassaugh, Benriach, Glendronach. And those 3 brands get repped together. And I was at a tasting. As a matter of fact, Rachel Berry, Master Distiller Rachel Berry, who's responsible for this, makes glorious whiskey. And she's over all of them, I think. But I went to a tasting, and it was those 3 brands. And I liked Benriach a lot. And I liked the Glenglassaugh that I have. I can't remember which one it was. Maybe it was Evolution. Was that a Glenglassaugh release? Anyway. But then Glendronach got poured, and it was specifically the 12. Then we got to try the older ones, and the 12 just was like, oh man, that's good. And ever since, if I only had one deeply sherried scotch in my cabinet, it would be Glendronach. And so many times when distilleries are trying to do really sherried scotches, my brain subconsciously compares it to Glendronach. My favorite Balcones releases where they're really sherried, my brain's comparing them to Glendronach. Can't help it, I'm a fan of Glendronach. So I'm not really objective with this because it got in my bones. But the nose, this is Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso sherry, and the nose is this deep, rich, buttery almond pound cake with like a figgy pudding, right? Or like an English toffee pudding, right? Like it's just this blend of deep, rich fruits and candied, rich, sweet almond, and something just popped in my head. And sorry for the hand clap, because that's gonna spike everything. So there's a restaurant in downtown Austin. It's still there. It's called True Lux, and it's a seafood restaurant. And back when I was eating meat, I would go there for my birthday because it's really expensive, and I would order the steak and lobster. And they had this dessert that I still don't know what it was called, but it was in a chocolate basket. And what I mean is they would make a chocolate container in the shape of one of those brown paper lunch bags that you used to take to school, but it was made out of chocolate. And it had the creases and everything, right? And they would fill it they would make a really rich pound cake, and then they would crumble it up into pieces and mix it together with berries like strawberries, blueberries, and raspberries, right? And almonds, and they would crumble it up into this mixture, and they would stuff that mixture into this chocolate bag, and then when they brought it to your table, they would tip it on its side and crack it and pour chocolate sauce on it. And every bite, it was the perfect amount of rich, but not so rich you can't eat more than one bite, but you really needed like a group of 5 to finish it. Every bite was this dense pound cake, almonds, berries, and a fancy chocolate bag. and a little bit of chocolate sauce. And I get a lot of those notes. Anytime I pick up Glendronach, I think, oh yeah, there it is. And there's that slight sulfuric note that I always get from sherried casks in the nose, but it's so mild that it doesn't dominate and it lets the fruit and pound cake take over. It's great whiskey. And the palate delivers everything you were looking for. It's sweet, it's almondy, it's fruit, but it's not boring, it's not overly candied. It's got some of those sort of like dry, viscous, sherried sulfur type notes. Sulfur is probably the wrong word, but sulfuric type notes. It's earthy, like turned over mulch. It's like a fall. This to me is the whiskey that is fall and desserts. Yeah, I feel like I'm ranting about this one, but it's really great. They were the second distillery to get a distilling license. So everyone knows it was Glenlivet was first in 1823 when the Excise Act from Duke of Gordon was passed, and it made it reasonable to get a license to distill in the Highlands. Glenlivet bought the first legal license. The second one, if I'm not mistaken, was Glendronach, and that's pretty cool. Okay. Let's get back to celebrating. And I'll just keep drinking this whiskey, which for me is celebrating. Really hardworking people with their nose to the ground trying to get done have a habit. And that habit is blowing past their goals without realizing it. And there's two reasons you do that. One, because like me, you often get tunnel vision and you just get so focused on doing, you hit that mark and then you just keep running. It's like going through the tape without realizing you hit the tape and you just keep running the race. And the other is, and this is much harder, when you get there, it never looks like you imagined when you set the goal. Never. It never does. When I was a musician and I said, I'm going to get a record deal, to me, that meant like, you've made it, you've arrived. I got my first record deal, and it was not great. I got my first offer for a record deal when I was 16, and the contract said, hey, we own as the record label literally everything, end of discussion. And we'll record an album for you, but we own 100% of everything, and the only money you can keep is if you play some shows. And I didn't take that. And then the second one, we just sort of went with it, and it ended up it was a better deal, but we ended up in similarly complicated situation. And when we signed the deal, there was no big fanfare or big moment. It was just like, now we're in the studio recording, and so my sights switched from, I want a deal, to, you got the deal, now you got to record an album. Now I'm focused on making an album, and then we're focused on touring and presenting the album, and we're radio interviewing the album, and then and it was really just a whirlwind. And over I found that looking back, I could see the marker where we had passed it, and I thought, yeah, but why would you celebrate that? It actually wasn't that big of a deal. That's a problem. When we first started Crowded Barrel, I was like, man, can you believe there's going to be a day when we release the first whiskey we ever made, not just sourced? And that's a big deal in my head. And then we got real busy, and I was building decks and doing construction on buildings. And the first whiskey we released that was ours was a 5-gallon barrel of single malt. It made maybe 40, 50 bottles total worth of whiskey. And you guys bought it, and it sold out like that, which we were really grateful for. And then, bam, we were on to the next thing, right? And I honestly missed that moment. I missed it completely. It was a month later that I went, holy crap. We released and sold out a whiskey we made. My hands touched it at every part of the process. That's a big deal. Now, did selling 50 bottles of whiskey change our lives? No. I mean, we were still the struggling business. We were still trying to figure out how to pay payroll. We were still trying to make ends meet. It didn't have this big, angels and choir singing and bells and whistles. It was just like, yeah, we did it. But tomorrow we got more to do. And that is a huge mistake. You need your brain, your psychology, your friends, your community, your coworkers really need you to stop and celebrate achievements, because if you don't, then you're never off the rat wheel. You're never off the wheel, and it never ends, and nothing is ever completed or done. And that's especially true when you work in an industry where at the end of something being finished, there's nothing to look at. Like if you are a construction worker, you can build a home and at the end be like, done, I built that. If you're working in almost any other job, finishing something is a small success followed by redoing it again the next day. And you can often forget to celebrate, and that can be the death of your soul. So, here is your marching orders. Sit down at every level in your marriage, your kids, your work, your personal life. Create some goals. And by that I mean not like, I'm going to be a better person, but achievable. I want to have been able to have done this in the next year. And make it so clearly defined that when you write it down, a stranger could pick it up, read it, and look at you and see if you've done it or not, or ask you a question and see if you've done it or not, right? And so it can't be, are you successful? Well, no, that's not real. It can be if you're a restaurant owner opening a second location. If you just started a new business, I hired my 10th employee. If you see what I mean? I walked 30,000 steps. I fill in the blank. It's got to be so clear, so definable that an outsider can look at it and know immediately whether or not you've accomplished it. And then when you do, promise me, even if it's only for one day or one night, stop, open a whiskey, go to dinner, sit with your friends in your community, and say, I did it. That thing that we talked about, it is now done. This is the after of the before. And celebrate. Please don't forget to celebrate. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here. Time for you to like and subscribe. Just pause, just for a moment in your journey, like and subscribe.